Welcome to Putting It Together, the podcast that goes through the entire body of work of Stephen Sondheim, show by show and song by song. My name is Kyle Marshall, your self-described Sondheim expert. Well, we're getting into the final couple of episodes here. Thank you so much for your patience, as there have been some gaps here as we've been releasing this schedule. Looking forward to subsequent seasons here. Still trying to figure out how I want to do the Saturday night discussion, whether I'm going to go song by song through that or do something similar that I did with The Frogs, where we kind of combined it into a few episodes, and then ultimately jumping into a much more detailed song by song discussion of Roadshow / Bounce. I will let you know after next week's episode with the finale, I am going to take probably the rest of the summer off before we jump back into the podcast itself. Still am planning on doing some bonus episodes throughout that, so it's not like you won't hear anything from me over the summertime, but just to prepare yourself that is going to be the case. That's really just some housekeeping for everyone out there. Let's get into this week's episode. No One Has Ever Loved Me. And that's the song we're talking about. That's not just an admission that I'm making here on air.
Ever loved me as deeply as you. No one has truly loved me as you have, Fosca. Love without reason.
Mike Meaney, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Because you're a brand new guest here, I always like to start off with some questions just to get to know you a little bit more. So I want to go into talking about theater in general, musical theater in general. What made you fall in love with the art form?
Sure. I think for me, starting was with the Disney movies was my introduction to music as a form of storytelling and a musical, even if it wasn't a live sort of performance. And having grown up in the Disney Renaissance and just kind of being exposed to what are essentially structured golden age musicals was my introduction. And so I always knew music as a form of storytelling. And from that, it kind of snowballed into movie musicals and then being taken to see like the High School Musical. And from there, immediately getting signed up for like youth theater. And then it's just pretty much been a part of my entire life since I was 7 years old. So it's pretty much always been there.
I mean, starting with Howard Ashman and Alan Menken is not a bad start, I wouldn't say, for most people.
No, there's certainly worse.
Actually, weirdly enough, just as a cool thing to connect to before we start recording, you mentioned how you were part of this production of Smile in New York City here recently, which is one of their first things that they do.
Yes, it was Howard Ashman's only Broadway credit. I was the associate director on that, and he did that with Marvin Hamlish.
That's right. I always forget about that. Yeah,
it's this weird thing where Howard Ashman did Little Shop with Alan Menken, and he did God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater with Alan Menken. And it's this whole crazy thing where Marvin Hamlish actually wrote an entire version of Smile with Carolyn Lee, and then she passed away. And so they were trying to find a replacement, and he ended up taking over, and they rewrote all of the songs, and he actually directed it too. So he was...
Yeah, right.
And then it did not go well. And that was kind of what sparked the move to California. And it gave us The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast.
All that stuff. So, I mean, honestly, Howard Ashman is always the biggest what if for me of like, had he lived longer, like what he could have actually accomplished type of thing. And for Smile specifically, I feel that there's just like burgeoning like cult around that show where there's like a lot of fans of that show, but no one really knows it.
Yeah, and it's this thing where I think it's the curse of not having a cast album. And so people never really got to hear what the show sounded like. There is a demo of him singing all of the songs that exist, and the licensing company, they have a very truncated version of, and actually Howard Ashman plays like 4 of the roles in there. So like you kind of get little hints of it, other than, the song Disneyland, which is like the one song everyone seems to know. But it's this oddity that people were fascinated by. And I know that we had people flying in from all over the country to come see it because they just needed to know what Smile was like. So it was an interesting experience.
Now, were you ever involved in theater growing up as well? Like, were you behind the scenes, on stage?
Yeah, I acted pretty much all the way up through college, and I was not a good actor.
I was about to ask what your best role was.
Oh, no, geez. My Hamlet was Cogsworth in Beauty and the Beast, nothing. Nothing crazy. And it was this thing where like, I've always loved theater, but I kind of always knew I'd never be able to make it as an actor. And I was okay with that. And I was asked to help assistant direct something right when I was graduating college. And then
Hmm.
this company let me direct after that. And it kind of lit this spark in me that I didn't realize that I really liked directing. And then I
Mm.
was able to kind of turn that into a career.
Can you verbalize that? Like, what was it about directing that you, I don't know, felt invigorated by?
I think it's just being exposed to theater so much. I've been watching theater my whole life. I've been in rehearsal rooms, and I always would be like, are we telling the story as clearly as possible here? Oh, that's an interesting way of approaching the scene.
Hmm.
And kind of being able to look at a show analytically. And I think something is like being, so I would say I was never really that good of an actor. And so I think that kind of helped give me a skill set how to speak to actors who are having issues and trying to overcome them in a rehearsal room, because I think I know better than a lot of other people, like what it's like to really be like struggling in a rehearsal setting, and being able to kind of help that
Mm.
along in a rehearsal room. And I really enjoy kind of being there for them while kind of cultivating this show with all of
Hmm.
them.
I'm about to make a sports analogy, which is dangerous because I'm just not a sports person at all.
Oh,
But
not alone.
from what friends have told me, this is true about coaches, where 99% of the time, the great coaches are people who are not like the best players. They were fine, or like they understood like what they could and couldn't do, but like the exceptional players have a hard time communicating how the team
Sure.
should function because they were always so naturally gifted at it. Whereas the people who had to struggle a little bit become great coaches because like I understand that this is hard to do and put together, and I need to communicate that to you in an effective way. And I'm thinking like artists are kind of the same thing, that the truly gifted like voices of God type of thing, that's hard to like teach to somebody else.
Sure. But my brother is played sports throughout his life, and he was just kind of
Mm.
like asking me questions about like about directing, kind of similar, because he goes to the theater every once in a while, but it's not
Hmm.
like it's a part of his life like it is with me. And I was explaining it to him. He goes, "Oh, you're a coach, okay." And that was just kind of it, where it just clicked in him that he's like, that makes perfect sense to me.
Now, do you recall the first time that you came across Stephen Sondheim, or like knew who Stephen Sondheim was?
Yeah, when I was in middle school, I was in a production of West Side Story.
Hmm.
And that was like the first time I heard the name Stephen Sondheim. And so I was introduced to him through that show. And then not long after, a local theater was doing Into the Woods. And so that was my first where I actually got to like hear the music of
Hmm.
Sondheim as well as the lyrics. And then from there, it kind of snowballed into like Sweeney Todd and Company and all of that. And so pretty much since middle school, I've been aware of Sondheim.
Have you directed any of Sondheim shows?
No, the one thing I have done, I was the assistant director last year on a concert production of The Frogs that
Oh,
Master
cool.
Voices did at Lincoln Center. And that was a really cool experience because Nathan Lane came in to host the evening and did a lot of rewrites on The Frogs, and we truncated it down to a one act. And so it was a really cool experience to kind of rework the show and live in it for a few weeks.
Is there any show that if I was to wave a magic wand, it's like, oh, this is the show I would love to tackle and try and put together?
There are two. One of them is A Little Night Music. I
Hmm.
just love that score so much. And the other one actually is Passion. So
Okay, I was gonna say very similar in some ways.
yes, because I both of the shows that they're so different, but I know it would
Mhm.
just be a blast to kind of live in those worlds for a while.
Well, I mean, just because you brought it up, Passion. When was the first time that you recall discovering Passion? The musical, not the concept.
Yeah. um, I think I got it for Christmas as a gift when I think I was 18 years old. So I think I
Mhm.
was like my freshman year of college. And
I like this. I'm sorry to interrupt, but
oh,
it's just like I
no.
like this idea of like, you know what every 18-year-old will love? Passion by Stephen Sondheim.
Honestly, though, it was one of my favorite gifts that year. So,
Mhm, mhm.
it's, writing my letter to Santa Claus going, please give me the CD to
Yeah, so
Passion. I need that cast album, please.
mhm.
And, being at that age, I had my car and I was able to, put it in the CD player, and I listened to it I remember listening to it over and over again when I got it.
What was it about it? What was it that drew you in?
I think it's just hauntingly beautiful, and has this energy in it that kind of flows throughout. And I like that, a lot of the songs don't have buttons. Everything just kind of bleeds into each other. So, when you have the freedom to be driving around going, well, songs just kind of keep going into one to the other. I guess I can keep going around the block a few more times with it.
That boy's been driving around here 4 times. Yeah. What's going on?
Just blasting Loving You.
That's right. I guess before we jump into like the song we're discussing here, I don't know if do you have any like hot takes or like deep analysis of this show or anything like that? Anything that you want to communicate about Passion?
I think it's going to have a Merrily We Roll Along moment.
Like, oh, interesting. Really?
I really think there's going to come a time where this gets dusted off and done in a way with somebody, and it creates a whole new legion of Passion lovers who will come to appreciate the show because there's so much good in it. And I think, to backseat drive, like, what it was, the original production a little bit, I just think audiences weren't ready for such a weird musical in terms of in terms of like a way to approach love and the intensity of it and how it's not structured in a normal musical way that everyone's used to, which, it's Sondheim. You should kind of expect him to be breaking rules even, I don't know what number show this is, 10 or so, somewhere in that. I think there's going to come a time where it gets revived and people learn to love it and appreciate it in a way that Merrily was last season.
That's a fascinating thing just to bring up there, because I mean, even with Merrily We Roll Along, up until that new production debuted last season, I was thinking like, man, they're throwing a lot of money and a lot of stars in this to a show that I don't know. I don't think it's going to connect with audiences very well. And then of course it becomes like the biggest like success of the Broadway season, wins a ton of Tony Awards. So I was proven so incredibly wrong. And that's my gut feeling too of Passion, but it's like, you get like the right person to interpret the work, the right people to put into that show, bringing in a new audience. And as much as people say like we don't have attention spans anymore, or we need everything spoon fed to us, I think that if you give a reason for people to show up, then they will engage with that work. So I think it's just presenting that in a way that people can really just embrace it the way that it was meant to.
And I think especially now that since Sondheim has passed and there seems to be this push to be doing more and more of his works, I think this one, it's only a matter of time before it gets scooped up and gets its moment in the sun, which I think it definitely deserves. I think it's a very good piece. And, I know people like to kind of brush it aside and consider a lesser Sondheim, but I think it's as good as Follies. It's as good as Company. It's as good as,
Yeah, I also wonder if there is room for reinterpretation. One of the things that I really have liked seeing over the last few years, this is more so with like the Rodgers and Hammerstein collection, taking those well-known works and kind of reinterpreting them in a way, like not changing the music or the storyline, but maybe updating the types of actors who are cast in them, or maybe even the setting to a degree, and showing people it's like, hey, this music still works, and the themes that they're battling are far ahead of the time than what I think people think about when they hear Rodgers and Hammerstein. I would love to see a similar thing happen with Sondheim insofar as there's still, I think, that prevailing idea, not amongst the people who have like, are Sondheim fanatics like me, but I think that there is still this idea that Sondheim is cold. He pushes people away, like it's analytical. It's like really, highbrow stuff, which I don't know is actually true. Like I understand why people say that to a degree, but it's like, I think, again, once you engage with it, it's like, oh, there's a lot of stuff here, and there's funny stuff here, and there's like deep themes in here, but not to a degree where it's like, oh, I'm reading a book.
Sure.
A huge history of like human emotion.
And I think for Passion too, I think people realize how much they relate to Fosca. And I think that's the reason why they don't like the show, because it shows their worst instincts and the ways of love, the obsessive nature. I mean, especially now, I'm sure like people Facebook stalking and going on Instagram, people they have crushes on, and just being able to look into their lives in a way that is very intense and kind of new. So, and I think Fosca really shows the worst side of that, and the things that people don't like in themselves are on full display with how she acts.
I mean, Sondheim would agree with you. He actually writes that in his book about that's why he thinks a lot of people push the show away. It's not even just like really with Fosca, but like at any given time through our history, we've been a Fosca, we've been a Giorgio, we've been a Clara, and that's sometimes not fun to contend with. And I mean, that's kind of what I love about the Fosca character in many ways, is that she does not hide who she is.
Yeah.
It's just like, blah, this is me. This is who I am. Like, deal with it type of thing. And I think people are like, oh, that's not how you're supposed to do this. And like, that's way too unnerving to be so like earnest about what you're feeling.
For me, I like seeing somebody so unapologetic on the stage and just letting it be.
Hey everyone, just Kyle breaking into the conversation to tell you about some of the people that help this show continue to go. If you'd like to help support the show for absolutely free, you can give a rating and review on whatever app you listen to podcasts in. That's of course greatly appreciated. Putting It Together is an independent podcast, so if you'd like to help monetarily, which will only help to grow and make this show better, you can do so over at our Patreon page. Please do not donate if it impacts you negatively financially. I also need to give a huge thank you to the God That's Good tier from Patreon of Alex, Barry, Christopher, David, Jack, Luis, Michael, Mika, Robert, Stephen, and Whitty. All right, let's get back to the show. So, Mike, what song are we here to discuss today?
We are here to discuss No One Has Ever Loved Me. Scene 14, as it's listed in 8 different scripts of the show.
Yeah, I mean, this is... Can I just say one more time, the book Look I Made a Hat decides to not write the song titles over top of these songs and just scene numbers, and it has been the hardest thing to figure out. Okay, what song is this? Where is it located in this book? It's very difficult.
The Herculean task of you having to organize this and putting it into some sort of cohesive fashion with how it's written or structured, I should say.
Now, if you can recall, what is happening like just right before this scene starts? What's the lead up into this song?
So the lead up to this song is a scene where the Colonel has discovered the letter that Giorgio wrote to Fosca earlier in the show that Fosca dictated to Giorgio to write. Colonel and Giorgio have this interaction with each other, and they decide that they're going to have a duel the next morning because the Colonel demands satisfaction, and he thinks that Giorgio is taking advantage of Fosca, and Giorgio is saying, no, I genuinely feel like this. And he's kind of goading the Colonel a little bit, going, well, what do you mean? Why wouldn't somebody write this? And keeps pushing him. And the doctor tries to intervene, and Giorgio is having none of it and decides that he's just going to lay it all out and say, no, I actually believe everything I wrote in that letter, and there's no need for any further explanation, and I'll see you tomorrow morning at 8.
On the dot, yes.
Yes. I was saying, then from there, the Giorgio tries to get the doctor to get him to Fosca's room, and the doctor says he's not going to help him this time, and Giorgio does it on his own. Walks
into her bedroom. He is being transferred. The doctor says he's going to be transferred to a different base to kind of end this relationship.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Before that scene, they're all around for Christmas dinner, and he gets a letter saying that he's going to be transferred. And it's a shock to everybody. Nobody knows. And the Colonel thinks that Giorgio did it. And I don't know what Giorgio thinks. It kind of comes out of left field there. And Fosca has a scene at the dinner table and runs away with the news.
Runs away, yeah. The long and short of it is that as they come together, Giorgio and Fosca, he tells her, like, yeah, the love affair between him and Clara is done, and she's sorry because she doesn't like to see him unhappy. And then we kind of lead into this scene that they have together. Before we get into the actual song here, there's this one question I would like to pose. And it's, I think, the reason why I struggle with this show to be like 5 out of 5 masterpiece level, rather than it just being like, this is a very strong, I really enjoy it, there's so much great music in it, and I really like some of the characters. And it's in particular the character of Giorgio, who I always have the hardest time tracking, like when the switch actually flips for him to be like, oh, I actually really do love this woman. So for you, when is that moment? When is the moment where you think he actually fully transfers over?
I think it happens somewhere around Loving You, and hearing this unabashed declaration of love, and something in him clicking, going, oh, I have lust for Clara. I think he's got a boy's idea of love for Clara, but he doesn't have a deep connection. And I think at that moment, it kind of allows him to be a little bit more introspective and realizing,
Mhm.
oh, love doesn't exist on a binary. It's complicated. It's all of these things. And I actually am starting to feel that towards her because, and just hearing the way that she thinks of me. And I think that's kind of what lets the dam break a little bit for him.
I like that. I will say to your point about it being brought back and having that merrily kind of reclamation, so to speak. There is apparently this London version that was done at the Donmar warehouse, which does not have an official recording nor a video recording of it. There is some bootlegs apparently that travel around the internet at times, but that's the one that Sondheim himself said, this is the one that nailed it. This is the one that got the understanding of both of these characters perfect. So I'd love to listen to that at some point in my life to really see.
And it's interesting that Jamie Lloyd directed that production.
Correct.
And he's been doing all this stuff with, the Sunset Boulevard and all. And so, but it seems from like the pictures and things, it was a pretty, for him, straightforward production without any sort of hat on it.
Yeah, this is Jamie Lloyd before he was like the Jamie Lloyd that we kind of know today. By the way, we have an upcoming episode where someone mentions that they would love to have Passion done by Jamie Lloyd, and that was before I learned that Jamie Lloyd actually did one before. But I understand what they're saying. I just need video screens everywhere.
Yeah, I think this
Passion with video screens.
Yeah, I think this was before his screen phase that he's in right now, and I think all the actors stayed inside too on this one. So
okay, so this is how we start. Giorgio speaks for a little bit and then goes into the song where he says, "I feel so much, but I'm not really sad." And Fosca says, "I thought you loved Clara." And Giorgio says, "I did love Clara, I did, but no one has ever loved me as deeply as you. No one has truly loved me as you have, Fosca. Love without reason, love without mercy, love without pride or shame, love unconcerned with being returned, no wisdom, no judgment, no caution, no blame."
No one has ever loved me as that woman has. No one has truly loved me till Fosca. Love without reason, love without mercy, love without pride or shame, love unconcerned with being returned, no wisdom, no judgment, no caution, no blame, no one.
I think it's interesting that we get rhymes in this
Yep.
part of the show, and it's, I know Sondheim said something. I wish I had the actual quote, so I apologize for paraphrasing, but it's this thing where if characters are speaking or thinking clearly and intelligently, they will rhyme. And if they're just kind of having stream of consciousness, like fluttering thoughts, there isn't a lot of rhyme. And I think, you think of Not Getting Married Today, where it's just this go, go, go because this person is. But here, we have Giorgio actually thinking about his feelings. And so all of a sudden we get rhymes in there.
Yeah, the other thing that I've really noticed throughout this show in particular is that rhyming normally, I'm actually going to, this is the counter example to this, but up until this point, rhyming has really been used as a shorthand for calculation. Like, I'm very calculate. I want you to think of something. That's why most of the letters rhyme. That's why when Fosca has been like thinking about what she's going to say to Giorgio when he enters, she rhymes for a little bit. But then you're right, the stream of consciousness is normally what this show kind of deals with, where there's not really a focus on making sure that there's rhyming couplets or even a rhyme scheme of much at all. So anyways, in this one, I think this is him fully falling into that love feeling, and now he's starting to rhyme.
Yeah, and for me, this song kind of feels like a counterpoint to Being Alive almost. Where it's a very similar, where I feel like there's a lot of similarities between Giorgio and Bobby. And this song kind of exists where, again, what I was saying earlier about the complexities of love that are very similar to what you hear in Being Alive. You hear in this, love's not just this sweeping declaration and, dancing on the ceiling like a Fred and Ginger movie, but there's much more to it. And it's interesting to me that with his declaration of love, he's focusing on, there's negative things, the shame, judgment, and no wisdom, and all of these things. So it's not just like the way that Sondheim does. It's not just these big sweeping declarations. That it's complicated and complex, and it's still kind of focusing on the negative, but done in a positive way.
Yeah, I think there's so much wrapped up into this, because the thing that I keep coming back to and contending with this show, and have now discussed with multiple different people, is that I think even coming out of the show, for most people, it's like, oh, it's the Fosca character that I'm thinking of. The original novel was called Fosca. From the original movie, I think people come out and like, oh my gosh, like that Fosca character is someone that stays with me and her journey stays with me. But in every version, even this accidentally, apparently, according to Sondheim, the actual journey is Giorgio's. It's him that changes throughout this story. And it's so easy, I think, for him to be kind of forgotten in this narrative, that he's the one who comes to realization of like, oh, this is what love is. And this is the love that I want to pursue. And I think this is the moment you have to really hammer that home. And that has to really land for the audience.
Yeah, he's definitely the engine for this show. And I've only been able to see the PBS version of this. And the classic stage version somehow ended up on YouTube. So I don't know how that happened, but I think it's like Giorgio needs to be the focus, because then we get to go on the journey with him, as opposed to, and I know like Fosca's I shouldn't say far more interesting, but it's the person who you're just like, what's going on over there with her, and you'd rather kind of lock into that rather than
this is probably like a really stupid example, but it's the one that immediately jumped to my head. But it's like Batman, and Bruce Wayne by themselves can be interesting characters. But who do you think of when you leave the movie? It's the Joker, because it's like he's so crazy and wild. But it is really the Batman story that you're following in any of the movies or comic books or whatever medium that you're watching them in.
Yeah.
Fosca is the Joker, is what I'm trying to say.
We'll make her the Riddler or something a little.
Yeah. So he continues on singing, "No one has ever known me as clearly as you. No one has ever shown me what love could be like until now. Not pretty or safe or easy, but more than I ever knew. Love within reason, that isn't love, and I've learned that from you."
No one has ever known me as clearly as you. No one has ever shown me what love could be like until now. Not pretty or safe or easy, but more than I ever knew. Love within reason, that isn't love. And I've learned that from
just live, laugh, love, That's just what we're trying to say.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting to go back to loving you. Like, she says she would die for him. And
yeah, right.
And I think that is,
and you believe it, because it's like, oh my, yeah, I think you're right.
And I think for Giorgio, like, I think that is a switch that gets flipped, because I think he realizes that Clara wouldn't die for him. And nor should anybody expect her to. She's a married woman with a child that she has to think of, and it's just
right.
And it's not, that's it's a kind of love, but it's more of a dalliance than anything.
Well, I mean, I think that is like the clear comparison that Giorgio is trying to make here. Like with Clara, it is love within parameters. We meet on these days. We meet in this location for this amount of time, and then we separate, and then yes, we can write letters to each other, but only for so much. And like there is this a structure to it that isn't really what love is. Like when he says love within reason, that isn't love, because love is unreasonable. It's just like this emotion that takes you over, and it's like, yeah, it doesn't really make sense, but it is what I'm feeling, and so I'm just gonna pursue this.
Yeah, understanding that it's not linear. It's it's a whole mess of different things, and it shouldn't have to live within these conditions. Exactly. Right. And it's a really nice moment of the realization of all of this, and I feel to me the entire show is kind of building to this moment here.
Far be it for me to give love advice. Like, my love life has been a complete train wreck, but like that from an observation, that is clearly the relationships you can see from a distance that just are not going to work. If it's like, well, love means that you have to say this, I love you 3 times each day, and you have to get me this thing at this moment. Or it's like, love is you showing this level, and like you have to do it in this way. It's like, okay, wait, there's way too many like rules are going into this now.
Or in like this day and age of always just like the couple's always posting these pictures together on social media with these captions, and I'm just like, I think
4 months I'm giving this.
Yeah. You have to go on and screaming from the rooftop. Everyone needs to know how much we're in love. It's like I don't know how much, to each their own, I suppose, but at the same time, it feels a little forced and fake as opposed to just two people being together and being able to love each other without having to go, see, we're in love, see, we're in love.
Yeah. Hashtag forever person, Not a sponsor. At this point, Giorgio, that is, observes that Fosca is trembling. She's in bed, by the way. I don't know if I made that very clear, but she's in bed when he's come in. And he asks, "Are you cold?" "No, I'm afraid." "Of what?" And Fosca then responds, "All this happiness coming when there's so little time. Too much happiness, more than I can bear." Giorgio admits that he has come to love her. There's this longer book scene, but ultimately this leads up to the fact that they then sleep with each other.
Are you cold?
No. I'm afraid.
Of what?
All this happiness coming when there's so little time. Too much happiness, more than I can bear. You do love me, don't you?
Yes. I love you.
Say it again.
And before that too, he does say, "I love you," and she says, "You mean it, don't you?" or something along those lines. And then and from there,
and then her line back is, "To die loved is to have lived," is what her kind of one of her last lines is.
Yeah, because I think he's concerned about doing something that might ultimately hurt her. But
earlier in the show, the doctor explicitly says that if she was to make love, she would die. Like, that is something that is seeded early in the show.
Yes, it's her being completely okay with this and an understanding that, it's I'd rather die this way than live alone without you.
And really, the moral here is that sex kills and that no one should do it. So the big thing I wanted to point out about this is, like, of course, this is like the reemergence of like that happiness theme, right?
Yes.
That we started the show with, like, so much happiness, but this doesn't ever really resolve musically.
No.
Really? So you're kind of like left like, oh, okay, we haven't even felt like this coming to a conclusion.
And what was interesting, I was reading somewhere that this is where Sondheim wanted the musical to end.
He really did, yeah.
And it kind of the show be bookended with orgasms, essentially,
Sure. To put it very bluntly, there's exactly, he mentions the fact that his conception of the show was start with Clara's orgasm, end with Fosca's, go to black. But he's like, with his collaborators, like, no, you really do have to end with this duel and like the fallout of all of this emotion type of thing, or else it's really going to feel like the story hasn't finished. Which
I appreciate because, I like that everything does come to a conclusion and gets wrapped up and all of this, because it was, and it's also kind of gives it a more, I guess, uplifting ending. If it's like, oh, they come together and they consummate their relationship, and isn't that lovely? And love always wins in the end. But if anything, the show tells us that, love is far more complicated than that. So we still
of course
a little bit more story to tell that I won't spoil for whoever's doing the finale for you.
Sure. I mean, one of the things though too, and I think this is why I feel like so invested in Fosca as a character. This is such a tragic thing for her to sing, which is like, oh, there's so much happiness I'm getting with so little time I have left on this earth. And I kind of get that. I guess not that I've ever been in this exact situation, but I could imagine and extrapolate that as like, imagine getting to just the end of your life, old age or whatever, and like, oh, I found true love for the first time, and I might have a few weeks or a couple of years left. It's like, why couldn't have this happened so much earlier? Type of thing. You're gonna feel that loss. Where I'm leading to with that too. Once again, I mean, people can call it like this by like the 90th time I've brought this up. As much as I hate bringing in biographical information into this, I do think that it's important that Sondheim writes this show at this time in his life and career. Because as he mentions, like, he writes this basically right after he falls in love for the very first time and he's in his 60s, late 50s, early 60s at this time.
Yeah, at this point, he would have been a little bit into his 60s too. So.
Yeah. When you make that admission and be like, yes, there have been relationships, but I never actually felt love before, to write then this show about someone who feels like they've wasted time until they found love does make it seem like, okay, he knows what he's talking about in this situation.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point to make because he understands, that time is not on his side. He's
Mm-hmm.
in the latter portion of his life, and so knowing that, to at least spend a little bit of time in love is better than to not be in love at all.
Right.
And I think too, it's not just about her health and the time that she has left because of how sickly she is, but knowing that Giorgio is being moved to a different base
Right.
the next day too. And she doesn't even know that he's about to fight a duel and may die the next morning. That's being kept from her too. So there's all of these other external factors outside of just her health being the time glass that's running out.
That's true. Yeah, there's all these other elements that are being thrown in front of them too, where even if she wasn't deathly ill, that there's these other things that could end this relationship prematurely. Now, talking about that duel, I do want to have a conversation about this because obviously they show this. This is, again, something that happens in the book, something that happens in the movie. Now it's something that's happening on the stage show. It's the Colonel and Giorgio having this pistol fight where I don't think either of them really wants to kill each other, but they kind of have to because of honor and all that stuff that's wrapped up in the time period that they're in. Before we get into the actual specifics, I do have a question that probably doesn't really have an answer.
No, I have not been in a duel.
Okay, great. Okay, I'll take that off my list. I was going to ask about why you think they don't overtly musicalize this in a way, like, for instance, Hamilton, many years later, musicalizes the duels that happen in that. And instead, this is it's a book scene that happens for this duel. Why do you think we don't actually hear music or a song or anything like that?
It's because it's ultimately a minor part of the greater whole of the story. For me personally, it's, we just saw Giorgio and Fosca come together, and knowing that this isn't like there are things that need to be tied up or towards the end of the show, I feel like a song would have just slowed down the story. And this way we can see what happens. And then I think the fast forwarding of what happens after the duel, which I won't get into for sake of your next guest, it's far more interesting to do the time jump as opposed to stopping and having the Colonel and Giorgio sing a song about a duel. I don't think the moment warrants a song personally.
Right.
It helps serve as like a transition to the finale.
It's interesting then. I think ultimately you're right. I don't think we need to see like Giorgio like contemplating or over explaining what is going on in that scene, but only because these things have happened throughout this show. It's interesting that they don't even try and do like a transition or a soldier's gossip or something like that to like just redo like that very quickly thing, whether it's just beating drums or whatever. Something to do like that bookend, and then we're into the finale and on the way. Mm-hmm.
And I'm personally I really like that, the shots are fired and you see what happens at the duel.
Yeah, he screams.
Yeah, Giorgio has his Fosca wail, and it's mirroring that. And I think that's far more satisfying, strangely, than any song, even if it was written by Sondheim, would be of him.
I should point that out. I can think of ways you could theatrically do this, by the way, but it's something that they never nailed, according to the creators. Both Lapine and Sondheim say the same thing. But his scream is supposed to be like exactly the same as Fosca's wail that we hear near the beginning, and they say never quite nailed that to make it very clear that that's what they're trying to do, is that it's the exact same sound. The actors just weren't able to like match pitches and that sort of thing.
That's a very big ask for two actors, because it's such a guttural thing that it's so to the individual that trying to mimic it would be very difficult to do, I imagine.
It's just interesting. This would be my pitch, and this is me saying I know better than James Lapine, apparently. You would think that they would just like take whoever is playing Giorgio and who's ever playing Fosca and get them just to scream together and like record it and mix it together, and then just play that when each of them has to do it. But then you have to rely on that sound cue hitting at exactly the right moment.
Yes. which is a bit of a tall order to.
Yeah, easier to do in film than it is going to be in live theater for sure.
Yes, the anything that can go wrong will go wrong.
Will go wrong.
Hitting a wrong
the last thing I just want to mention about the duel in particular, if it's not immediately obvious, like Giorgio does not want to actually hit the colonel, even though he does. He tries to like just fire it off, but the bullet accidentally hits the colonel.
Yes.
So yes, it's a mistake. It's a mistake on his part that he actually shoots the guy that he doesn't want to shoot.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that in the scene before, No One Has Ever Loved Me, when they're deciding to have the duel, where Giorgio seems very indifferent to this, and he's just like, well, if that's what you want, then that's what we're going to do, because he just kind of seems very not apathetic, but just very like indifferent to the whole idea, because it's just like nothing matters anymore to him, because he's so deeply in love with Fosca and knows that he'll probably never get to see her again, so might as well just die if that's the case.
So correct me if I'm wrong. I think I might be forgetting a specific moment. Does Fosca die before the duel or after the duel?
After the duel. It's I think they say it's about 3 days after the night they spent together.
Okay. Yeah, so it's not like an immediate thing that happens, because I was going to say, like, you could, I guess, play it that way, that he's given up because Fosca has now passed away, but that hasn't happened yet. So there goes that theory.
Yeah, but it seems like he knows that he's never going to see her again, and he's has this deep love for the first time in his life, and so that's a whole different set of blinders that are placed on him compared to the other love blinders that he wears for most of the show.
And you know, to be fair, the colonel recovers. He does not die, so you know he's going to be fine. He'll get his pension, I'm sure.
I think they say it's a few months of recovery they placed in.
Where do you see? I mean, I know this is skipping ahead towards the finale to a little bit, but for your money, if you had to make a guess, like what happens to Giorgio after this, after these events here? Like he goes off to his next post, and then what? Is he just a shattered man for the rest of his life, or does he find love? Do you think?
I think there's a world where he does find love now that he knows what it is. Like, and it's you know, I imagine him meeting somebody else and having a connection and going, oh, this is it's either the Clara love or it's the Fosca love, and him being able to differentiate between the two instead of just going, it's all love in the same, so what do I care? So I think there's a world where this is kind of a coming of age story, is how I like to see it, of just this young love compared to mature love. And so
for me, it's always been, or at least doing this deep dive has really shown me that this is an evolution from something that you said before, like a boy's envisioning of what love is, to a much more like emotionally mature response to that. So it's like, oh, okay, now that I've had these experiences, like I now know what it truly feels like to give yourself over to this emotion and to sacrifice yourself, I guess, to a certain degree for that other person. And I think that's the emotional change that Giorgio goes through in this show.
Yeah, and he's willing to sacrifice himself for Fosca, and so I think that, and I don't know if that's something he would have done with Clara. Weirdly, if the husband found out, I don't know what would happen between the two of them.
Ooh, look at the time, and then he like heads out. Any last thoughts you have about this song that we talked about?
No, I really think this is a beautiful, no pun intended, climax to the show, and a way to kind of have everything build to this particular moment between Giorgio and Fosca. I'm curious, because you've been doing these deep dives, and I'm sure you have your preferences to certain Sondheim shows over others. I'm curious, where did this land on your scale at the start, and if it's changed at all since your deep dive?
I think that's a great question. Thank you so much for asking me. I would have definitely said before this season started, I would have said this would have been like kind of like middle for me. Like there's the shows that for me personally that are definitely just like straight to the bottom, which are Anyone Can Whistle, Do I Hear a Waltz, Sorry to Say, The Frogs. Like those are at the very bottom of my list. And then there's kind of some of this like medium stuff, like, you know, Saturday Night and Roadshow, and Passion would be kind of above those. But after I've gone through this, I think it's definitely elevated to like just outside of like my top ones. What I mentioned there before is true, and I think maybe I'm waiting for like that perfect production of this, whereas I have my like Sweeney Todd's Little Night Music, Into the Woods, Sunny in the Park with George, which are like like the masterpieces that I call, like the ones that I keep going back to. And this, I think, would be the ones in the list of like just outside of masterpiece. Like I just have a couple of like weird criticisms or things that prevent me from going full force into it, which are like this merely mostly because of the book, because I don't think the book still really stands up to scrutiny very much, and Pacific Overtures. Like those are kind of like the three like that just don't quite hit masterpiece level, even though the music is like phenomenal to me. But I'm waiting for like that perfect production, so I'm like, oh, completely has unlocked it for me.
Yeah.
And like this is now like 5 out of 5. Have you always though been like full into it, or did it take you a while to have it rise in estimation?
I've always loved, and I think it's because I came to it definitely later. I think a lot of people have a very similar thing where they go through Follies, they go through Sweeney Todd, they go and they're just like, all right, what's next? And then they're like, oh, there's this one from the early 90s that was his last James Lapine collaboration. You're like expecting, an Into the Woods type thing, or Sunday in the Park, and it's also where I was in like my musical theater journey at that time. I was like discovering Floyd Collins and Hello Again and these other more complex pieces of theater, and so I think I was kind of like in a mindset that was like more open to a show that's a little out of left field in terms of structure and things like that, and I think just being able to listen to it over and over again helped me a lot, where I think if I were to have seen a production of it first, I don't know if I would have been so open to it right off the bat.
That's the thing too. Like, I hate that I'm about to sound like the most pretentious person in the world, but because I'm such a Sondheim freak, to me, that is what Broadway sounds like. And I think why I get so like drawn into like Adam Gettle and like those types of people, like the lushness and the sweeping scores. Whereas, not that I can't fall in love with certain modern Broadway shows, but there is a modern Broadway sound that sometimes is just like, no, I don't like this. And I have to kind of push through that to be like, oh, actually, there is actually some really good lyrics and music in this, but it's just like a bit too poppy for me.
Yeah, it's I don't mean it in a pejorative sense, but there's a generic quality.
Yeah.
I know that makes it sound like I'm kind of poo-pooing, but there's this.
No, you just said all Broadway is terrible now.
Yes.
Like, that is what you just said. So
there's always exceptions, but this, like you said, sweeping, majestic quality is not as prevalent as it was years and years ago. But it's
that's right.
As the time shifts and the style shifts, it's one of those things.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Broadway is always evolving. Every art form needs to contend with the time that they're in, and all that kind of stuff too. So if it was to stay static, that means it's a dying art form, and you don't want that either.
Exactly. So. And I think there's a world where both of them can exist side by side, and we'll be very content.
So, Mike, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day. There is a last question that I've been asking every single person here this season, which is the name of this show is Passion. Of course, that is like an emotional feeling. So you can take this question any way you want. What are you the most passionate about right now?
It's going to sound so basic, but it's theater. It's part of me nonstop every day. And especially I've been in rehearsals nonstop for pretty much all year, which is a wonderful thing to have, but it's every waking moment is consumed by theater in one or another. So theater is my answer.
That's amazing. So then two last follow-up questions before we wrap up here then. This episode, just based on my schedule here, I think is going to go up either June, potentially July, but I think it's going to be up in late June. So is there anything coming up that people could check out?
No, at this point, I will have wrapped up my assistant director gigs here in the city where I was working with J2 Spotlight. And I think fans of this podcast will also appreciate this theater company that does lesser known musicals or breathes life back into them. Rob Schneider is the artistic director, and he just does a fantastic job with that. And after that, I having a break, which I'm a little grateful to have, because I have this is the most I've been home in months to be able to sit down and do this podcast. So, and I'm waiting to hear back about things right now. So I don't want to, count my eggs before they're hatched.
Yeah, that's fair. For you, do you get a chance to see a lot of theater in New York, or are you just too busy with your job?
It kind of depends. It comes in waves where I will not see anything for a couple of months, and then I'll see 8 shows in 2 weeks.
Well, I was going to ask you, just because, you know, you're in New York. What's the last thing that you can recall that just really knocked your socks off? That's like, this is like a great piece of theater.
I got to see the Sunset Boulevard revival, and it was remarkable. And it's just being able to strip it away, and the performance that she is giving is, everybody who's like, it's amazing, you're gonna love it. And I'm just like, oh, okay. Like, I just assumed everyone was like, you know, overselling it. And I think it is impossible to oversell the performance that she is giving. It is just one I will remember for the rest of my life.
Yeah, a lot of people have been telling me about how, like, you think you know Sunset Boulevard, and you watch this and like, oh, they really attack this in a very different way than what you would think from what some people have called a dusty musical. And now it's like, oh, there's some juice to this. Yeah,
it's never been one of my, like, let me bust out Sunset Boulevard to listen to. It's with Andrew Lloyd Webber, but it's this production is just, it's so remarkable. And it shows that you don't need a house, you don't need, you know, cars, you don't need, all you need is the story told in a fascinating way. And in the end, that's it. And so if you can see it before it closes, I highly recommend getting over
Amazing.
there.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for taking the time today. If people wanted to see what you're up to, follow you online, is there a way to do so?
Yeah, Instagram is pretty much the only social media I use these days, and my handle is @RealMikeMeaney, and my website's linked there too. That's if you're really interested in that. but otherwise, Instagram is the place for me.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This is so much fun.
Thank you so much for listening. You can send emails to puttingittogetherpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow me at the Kyle Marshall on Instagram. This is an independent production, and you can support the show on Patreon by going to patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast. Putting It Together is available on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere you get podcasts from. Consider subscribing so that you never miss an episode. Next week, we're going to be talking about the finale, and just like Sondheim's original vision, it's going to end with an orgasm. As always, a big thank you to the great Chris Taniguchi, who designed the podcast artwork, and to Nick Driscoll for composing our theme music. Well, we've reached the end of our episode. Yes, I know. Goodbye for now.